Finally tonight, a look at a crisis looming in the Great Lakes that could impact drinking water and the multi-million-dollar blue economy that Michigan depends on. It was just 1 year ago that algae blooms in Lake Erie contaminated water for hundreds of thousands of Michigan and Ohio residents. This year, the blooms are even worse. And just 2 weeks ago, Michigan Congresswoman Candace Miller and Congressman Tim Walberg announced legislation to reduce pollution that feeds the algae. And scientists are closely monitoring the water to see what happens next. Take a look. Dr. Tim Davis is anxiously watching the actors gather for a drama he hopes will not play out. Dr. Davis is an ecologist with the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. His specialty, harmful algae blooms.
The organism that dominates these blooms in the lake is called microcystis, and it produces the toxin microcystin, which is what caused the Toledo water shutdown last year.
This was the scene a year ago on the southern shore of Lake Erie. 400,000 people in Ohio and in southeast Michigan were left without drinking water for 3 days. The cause? A bloom of toxic algae that covered the surface of the lake in blue-green slime, making the water unusable for drinking, bathing, or swimming. Algae blooms in Lake Erie are not a new phenomenon. They were a constant problem during the 60s and 70s when the lake was heavily polluted. What is new is one of the causes of the blooms: agriculture. Tons of chemical fertilizers are sprayed on farm fields. Not all of the fertilizer is absorbed into the soil, and during heavy spring rains, the remainder flows off of fields into streams, down rivers, and out to the lake. The fertilizer is loaded with phosphorus, an algae superfood. Mix phosphate runoff with warming temperatures due to climate change, and you've got the perfect recipe for an algae bloom. 2014 was not the worst algae bloom on record or the largest. The largest bloom occurred in 2011 when 2,000 square miles of the lake's surface were covered in green gunk. Dr. Jeffrey Reuter has researched Lake Erie for 40 years.
The bloom in 2011 really got everybody's attention. That bloom was 2.5 times worse than anything we'd ever seen before. I'd never seen a bloom that when you hit it with a boat, it actually slowed you down. It was that dense.
The bloom in 2014 was significant because it happened unusually early. Weather conditions helped wind and waves push the bloom toward shore, where it parked over the intake for Toledo's municipal water supply and pumped more and more toxins into the water. Once the toxins reached harmful levels, water from the lake became unsafe and unusable. The economic impact of the bloom was swift. Tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry on the Lake Erie coast. Empty beaches meant no one buying sunscreen, picnic food, or ice cream from local businesses. Fishing charters ground to a halt. Revenue disappeared. Paul Pachowski is a fishing charter captain on Lake Erie.
The water quality influenced my customers' perception of Lake Erie. I had to actually move out of this end of the lake and move to another area that wasn't so deeply impacted by the bloom. And that costs. I mean, you're chasing around after fish that are farther away, harder to catch, and out of their normal patterns.
Michigan and Ohio were not the only areas affected by the algae bloom. Algae blooms are a Lake Erie issue, making them an international issue. This is Pelee Island, the largest island in Lake Erie, 22 miles off the Ohio shore on the Canadian side of the lake, and home to 300 people who depend on the lake for a living. At the end of August 2014, an algae bloom shut down the island's water supply. The inhabitants of Pelee Island and the visitors they depend on were without drinking water for almost 2 weeks, 4 times as long as the residents on the lake's southern shore, severely damaging the island's seasonally dependent economy. Imagine if a bloom that large happened this year near Cleveland. That's why Dr. Davis is so anxious.
As climate change continues to occur, these types of events, these harmful algal blooms, will become larger, more frequent, and potentially more toxic.
Heavier than normal rains have caused tons of phosphorus to pour into Lake Erie, and a large bloom is growing in the middle of the lake. All the signs point to an algae bloom that will be as severe, if not worse, than 2011.
We hope there is not going to be another water crisis, but it's hard to tell at this point.